Nancy and Howard had been married for 3 years and were long used to their friends joking about how they met. That was because they met when Howard was the director of the company where Nancy worked as an accountant. At that same time, Howard Foster was married and was known in business circles as an exemplary family man. At first, Nancy didn't even look at the director, who she felt was the perfect example of a highly professional businessman. But when Howard began to shower her with attention, the woman realized that it was more than innocent flirting. At first, there were just little compliments that made Nancy smile sweetly. But over time, thanks to direct pursuit and persistent courtship, Howard managed to awaken reciprocal feelings in the heart of the single accountant. "But he's married, darling. Don't forget that when you decide to go on a date with him again," said Megan, Nancy's best friend. "I understand, but Howard is such a sweetheart, and he promised to get divorced from me," Nancy replied dreamily. To the surprise of the company's employees, the affair between the infatuated director and his accountant bloomed so quickly that just 6 months later, it became clear to everyone around them that their wedding was inevitable. At the same time, striving to fulfill the promise he'd made to Nancy, Howard divorced his wife as soon as possible. And so, after going through all the necessary procedures, he was free to enjoy the company of his new love. It is also worth mentioning that Nancy was extremely happy to have found true love and family happiness by the age of 30. Unfortunately, the euphoria of living with Howard ended as abruptly as it begun. This was partly due to the fact that the young businessman flatly refused to have children, constantly arguing that Nancy still had time and that she shouldn't tie herself down with a child. "But honey, I'm already 30. If I don't have kids now, then when?" Nancy asked indignantly. Howard just shook his head reproachfully in response and quickly changed the subject. But that wasn't the only issue. 3 years into their marriage, Nancy started to worry. The truth was that Howard started treating his wife with noticeable coldness and had even tried to transfer her to his partner's office. Nancy understood that this was most likely because her husband was ashamed of the staff's silent condemnation and didn't want to be seen together at work. However, she remembered the time when Howard wasn't the least bit embarrassed that his fiancée was working for him. And yet, Nancy felt the chill emanating from her husband when they spent time together. Of course, she tried not to focus on it, doing her best to convince herself that their relationship was fine. That's why Nancy invited her husband on a vacation to Miami, where they could bask in the sun on a warm beach and indulge in love, like in the first months when they had just started dating. To Nancy's great surprise, Howard happily embraced the idea and booked the plane tickets himself. But when there were only a few hours left before the flight, the young businessman suddenly changed his mind. "I'm sorry, dear. I know I'm letting you down, but there's this audit going on, so I can't go to Miami with you," Howard said with a deep sigh. After his words, a scarlet blush flooded Nancy's cheeks, and her eyes instantly filled with tears. "God, Howard, can't you get out of your financial hell for just 1 week?" Nancy exclaimed from her heart. Howard just shrugged his shoulders and wandered back into his office with a hint of pretentious grief on his face. But Nancy was determined to go on a vacation in Miami, so she made the difficult decision to go by herself. The unfortunate woman was well aware that she didn't want to spend her much-anticipated vacation within the 4 walls of their house. So, after saying goodbye to her husband, Nancy went on the long journey, not knowing that, very soon, her life would be turned upside down. The flight from Chicago to Miami wasn't that long, so Nancy didn't really have time to come to her senses. Soon, she found herself under the gentle sun of the South. The beach and the warm water of the ocean coasts filled Nancy's heart with the glorious feeling, as if a healing balm passed over her tormented soul. While enjoying her vacation, the woman tried not to think about how Howard was desperately trying to solve his company's problems. One day, swimming in the warm coastal waters, Nancy saw a strong wave pick up a 7-year-old girl and spin her in its turbulent vortex. Even though the little girl was wearing a life jacket, the water still almost covered her mouth. Realizing that everything could be over in just a couple of seconds, Nancy threw herself into the water without any hesitation. Fortunately, at the very last moment, the brave woman managed to desperately grab the screaming girl by the arm and pull her out of the foamy ocean waves. Holding the trembling child close to her, Nancy got out of the water and sat her on a beach chair. In the same instant, a handsome tall man of about 35 ran up to them. "Thank you, ma'am. If it weren't for you, I only got distracted for a moment, and Hannah was already in the water." The man began to excuse himself, blushing to the roots of his hair. "It's all right, I understand." Nancy hurried to reassure the stranger. In gratitude, the girl's father offered to buy her some ice cream at a nearby cafe. "You know what? That would actually be wonderful," Nancy said, lowering her eyes in embarrassment. The young people talked on their way to the cafe and couldn't help but feel a strong connection. As it turned out, the young father's name was William Porter. His wife had tragically died of cancer 3 years earlier, leaving the grieving husband alone with a young daughter to care for. Fortunately, William didn't give up and was doing his best to provide for his daughter Hannah with everything she did. She helped him find the strength to live on. Of course, not a day went by that the young father did not think about his late wife. So, William was in no hurry to start any new relationships or let a new woman into his life. To Nancy's surprise, her new acquaintance was very interesting, and she found herself talking to him about everything in the world. But as it turned out, William would find out the most interesting thing much later. In fact, the young widower, like Nancy, lived and worked in Chicago. He also had flown to Miami to take a break and to pamper his little daughter. This is truly a gift of fate. Not only is he so handsome, but he also lives in the same city as me, Nancy thought, blushing at her own discovery. The woman's timidity was also explained by the fact, despite her fight with Howard, she was still faithful to him. So Nancy kept glancing at her phone screen, afraid to miss a call from her husband. But despite his wife's hopes, Howard never called. Of course, Nancy knew that her husband would be busy, but on the other hand, she had been on vacation for almost 5 days now, and her husband hadn't called even once. Without even realizing it herself, Nancy was falling for William. She was enjoying his company more and more with each passing minute. William worked in a law firm that provided a wide range of legal services. Meeting every day on the beach, the young people began to spend almost all their free time together, much to little Hannah's delight. And Nancy even caught herself thinking a couple of times that she was drawn to William like a magnet. It's hard to say if it was love at first sight, but there was no doubt that the feelings were mutual. To William's credit, knowing that Nancy was married, he was in no hurry to cross the line of illicit intimacy. The vacation passed imperceptibly, and soon, Nancy was forced to get ready to go back home. Embracing William and Hannah, the woman promised to call them soon. And then, William allowed himself a hot kiss that filled Nancy's lips with a fire of passion. "I'll definitely find you. Do you hear me?" Nancy whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. To the great sorrow of the lovesick vacationer, returning home was not as rosy as she had hoped it to be. A tragic coincidence caused by a change in the airline's flight schedule meant that Nancy arrived in Chicago a few hours earlier than planned. Wanting to surprise Howard, the caring wife decided to tell him about her early arrival. Imagine Nancy's surprise when she opened the door and saw unfamiliar women's shoes in the hall. And then she heard strange sounds coming from the depths of the house. There was an unfinished bottle of drink and some leftovers of yesterday's dinner on the dining table. And when Nancy came to the bedroom, a shocking scene appeared before her eyes. Unable to hold back her bitter tears, the woman covered her eyes with her hands and ran out of the room. Nancy's reaction was so strong because she saw Howard lying in the arms of a woman she didn't know. "Nancy, wait, it's not what you think," Howard shouted after her, confused. But the deceived woman did not hear her husband's words as she ran out of the house, dismayed. "God, I left William and Hannah for that scoundrel," Nancy said with tears in her eyes. Deciding to stay with Megan for a while, the distressed woman told her friend about everything that had happened in her life recently. "Well, my friend, unfortunately, I was right when I asked you to be careful about this womanizer. First, he left his wife for you. And now, apparently, he's leaving you for someone else," said Megan, who had never liked Howard. Nancy burst into angry tears. She simply couldn't stop sobbing. The woman understood perfectly well that the best way out of this situation would be to get divorced and never have anything to do with Howard again. But first, Nancy decided to call William and tell him about her decision to leave her husband. However, instead of hearing William on the other end of the line, she got a recording of an indifferent voice informing her that the phone was not in service. But no one could have predicted what would happen next. It all started when Nancy's mother-in-law called and told her that Howard had been in a car accident. Realizing that given the circumstances, she couldn't leave her husband now, Nancy went to the hospital. But when the deceived wife entered Howard's room, she saw a woman in her 40s with a noticeably rounded belly sitting at his bedside. Nancy had no doubt that this was her husband's pregnant mistress. "You're such a hypocrite, refusing to let me get pregnant for 3 years, and then going off and having a baby with your mistress," Nancy thought, barely holding back her tears. The deceived woman was confident that her husband was all right and that his life wasn't really in any danger. Without saying a word, she left the hospital and tried to call William again. To Nancy's great delight, Hannah answered the phone and announced in her angelic voice that Daddy was busy. And then Nancy heard William's pleasant baritone. With the politeness inherent in many lawyers, he invited her for a visit. Can you even imagine what was happening in the soul of this poor woman? In such a short span of time, she had experienced the dizzying holiday romance and the vile betrayal of her husband. Nancy's thoughts raced around her head, forming a tangle of feelings and images. It seemed to the enamored woman that she had grown wings, endowing their owner with incredible inner strength and energy. When she saw William on the lawn in front of his house, Nancy shouted happily and waved to the man. A few seconds later, not paying attention to the surprised passersby, the young man hugged her tightly and they began to kiss passionately. At that moment, little Hannah quietly stepped out of the house. Laughing happily, she hugged her dad and the woman she thought of as her new mother for some time already. Looking at the three of them, it was clear that they wouldn't be fazed by the difficulties of Nancy's impending divorce. It was obviously the beginning of a new family based on loyalty and trust.